Okay, we're going to take a look now at some of our more advanced rendering options and lighting options. The first thing I want to do is show you pretty much everything that's available in the atmosphere editor, and that is our light tab, where we have standard, global ambience, global illumination, and global radiosity. I'm going to close this out right now, and I'm going to create just a small scene just to kind of demonstrate these different options that we have. So I'm just going to add in a sphere and another one and just kind of scale that down and bring that in. And now two spheres, maybe we'll add another one just to kind of show a little bit of variation. A little bit, we'll make a big one in back. And we'll drop that down onto our ground plane. And now I want to give these different colors. The first one I'm going to grab right here. I'm just going to go into our material editor. We're going to edit its color to a blue. And I'm going to click OK. And the back one I want to edit to a red. Or maybe a little less. We'll use the clay. And click OK. And I'm going to rotate our views around a little here. And now we're going to take a look at our different lighting. Now with standard lighting, you can see we just have our shadows, and it's not very realistic looking at all as far as lighting goes. But if we go into our atmosphere editor, which you can do by clicking F4 or by going up to atmosphere editor, we're going to select the light tab. And if we take a look at global ambience and kind of see what happens with that, we're not going to notice much of a change, and that's focusing mostly on our ambient light, which we can also adjust our different settings right here of our light intensity, and all these do affect each one of these settings for both global ambience, standard, global illumination, and radiosity. And now what global ambience is doing is mostly lighting our scene with ambient light from our sky. And if you notice a kind of a large color change here, if we look at standard, we can see we have a duller color. It's a little bit darker, but once we turn on global ambience, we'll get a much brighter color. And now with this, we can adjust our artificial ambience. We can make that a lot larger. You can see our areas, our dark areas, have lit up quite a bit. And this is kind of a way of faking radiosity and faking global illumination. It's a much quicker technique, much quicker rendering than if you were to actually use radiosity and global illumination. So we up that up to 1. We'll see that we get a lightened area a little down here, and it's just kind of faking that effect. We can also adjust our sky dome lighting gain. We'll bring that up a lot higher, and now we can see our objects are extremely lit up. And that's just pretty much projecting more light from our sky dome. And I'm going to bring this back down a bit lower to where we were before, just so we're kind of back where we were. We can also adjust the overall skylight color. And right now it's kind of set to a blue, but we can change that to any color we wanted to. And we can also adjust our quality boost. Faster, of course, which is the lower amount, which is not going to look as good, but it will render much quicker. And better, of course, is going to take a lot longer to quicker, but it's going to look better and produce much more realistic looking results. But if we're going for a lot more realism here, we're going to turn on global illumination, which is definitely going to take a lot longer to render, but we're going to end up with a more realistic looking effect. We can see the shadows now on the ground. If we get our preview to render just a little, you're going to notice a much more darkening effect. As you can see, it is taking a lot longer to render now that we have this effect on, because it is a much more advanced lighting. And we have this dark areas showing up around, which is kind of part of a shadow and a more realistic looking lighting effect. We can once again change our artificial ambience if we wanted to. And we could also change our sky dome lighting gain and our overall color. And all of these functions are still available for our global illumination. But the real neat one is global radiosity. And now if you're not aware of what radiosity is, it's the bouncing of light, referred to in real life as earthshine, where if you were to look at the moon, you would notice that sometimes, even though it's only a sliver, that you can still see the rest of the moon. Now that's called earthshine. which is translated into computer terms to radiosity, which is pretty much the bouncing of light. The reason the moon is lit up on the side is because the light from the Earth is shining onto that part of the moon and lighting it up. Well, it's basically the exact same principle in our 3D animation software, and it's particularly right now in View. So if we take a look at our radiosity settings here, and now we're going to get a preview in a little bit, just because it does take a lot longer now to render, because radiosity takes a very long time to render, and to produce a very good result is going to take a while. But we can notice already in the preview that we already have light sort of bouncing off our other objects and reflecting their colors onto other objects, which is the reason why I'm using this brightly colored objects, or this bright blue. We can see a hint of the blue actually showing up on our pretty much white sphere that we have in here, and it's also showing up on our clay texture and back. So by enabling radiosity, we're able to light up areas more realistically using bounced light. And we can also control these settings in the actual rendering options, which we'll get into in just a little bit, to actually go more in depth and control it a little bit more, how long the render times are, and look overall quality. But right now we can actually see, even with our default settings, that we have our blue from our sphere bouncing off from our light and actually reflecting onto our white, or what used to be a white sphere, which is now has hints of blue in it. And that's all because our light is bouncing off. The same thing if we came around the side, we'd also notice that we have a little bit of our clay texture also reflecting onto our sort of white tannish sphere, which we'll notice if we get a little preview here. Of course, it might not be as bright as the blue, because the blue is a much brighter color. And it also depends on exactly where the light is shining. So if the light is directly shining on this clay texture, we're going to notice more of it bounce. And it also depends on how bright that light is in order to get our specific effects that we want. But if you notice up here, we've lost our artificial ambience. And that's because global radiosity, you're not going to want ambient light, because it's using our bounced light from every single object in the scene. It's bouncing light off our sky dome. It's bouncing light off our ground plane. Each one of our individual objects is affecting each other, and they're all shooting light off in different directions, pretty much putting their colors onto other objects. The same thing if you were to, if you wore a brightly colored green shirt and it was a heavily lit room, you'd notice sort of the bounce back of that green on your neck and on parts of your face, because that light will bounce off that color and kind of project onto other objects. Same thing if you ever notice some green screen shots. If you've ever worked with a green screen before, if the actors are too close to the green screen, you will notice that that green is actually bouncing onto the actors, which becomes a lot more difficult for compositing, which is why the green screen is usually a little bit farther back from the actual actors and where they're performing. Now we also have the ability to change whether or not we want any ambience in the light in the scene at all. And ambient light is pretty much just fake light. It's the faking of radiosity. So we can bring this all the way down to for our light balance, we can bring it whether we want all directly ambient light or all sunlight. And now doing it all sunlight is actually going to be more of a realistic effect, because we only have one light in the scene, and it's going to be producing all of our major light in the scene, and all of our shadows and things will be dependent on that specific light. And we won't have any ambient light, because ambient is pretty much just faking that radiosity. So if we're actually using radiosity, we really don't need to fake it. Of course, like I said, in order to increase rendering times, you might want to. But if we notice here, we kind of have dark areas, but that's because we might need to up our gain. So if we up our gain a bit, it's going to give us a much brighter setting and much more powerful radiosity, but it's also going to up the rendering time. Radiosity does take a very long time to render, which is why it's sometimes important to bake your objects for certain animations, and we'll show you object baking in a little bit. But if you notice our preview now, we're going to pause that just for a sec so it would render a little bit quicker. But you notice there's a lot more blue now on this clay texture. So the more you up your gain, the more of a radiosity effect you are going to achieve. And of course, if it looks a little grainy or it doesn't look quite right, especially with some of the shadows that might get produced on the ground, you're going to want to up your quality boost. But all of this affects our rendering time, which could take forever sometimes to render, multiple, even days sometimes, especially if you have ecosystems and things like that in the scene. But there are ways of controlling your lighting settings to speed up the rendering process. And we're going to take a look at that now. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and we're going to take a look at our actual rendering options now. So if we right mouse click on our render tab to get our render options, we're going to set this to user settings so that we can actually go in and edit our quality of advanced effects. So everything is all linked, all the lighting is a link to our advanced effects quality, which we can also adjust this bar for faster or better. So that's pretty much self-explanatory. But if we take a look under the edit, we have the ability to use custom settings. And now we can set up our indirect lighting, so how many samples we want, and the more samples, the better the quality, and our adaptive sampling, which is all pretty much set up faster, better, to give you an idea. And you can go through and adjust things up and down to pretty much either speed up your rendering or give you a better effect if you have more time to render. Vue has a wonderful network rendering system that is extremely easy to set up. So if you have the ability to plug into other computers, use that. Even rendering a single frame, you want to be using the render cows and all that, because it's Hyper-V is just wonderful. Now if you take a look here at jittering, we also have reduced pulsations and standard, which, depending on which setting you have, could take longer or could be quicker to render. We also have our bucket size, which is our evaluation of certain areas. Right now it's set to 16 by 16, which is actually pretty quick, which it goes all the way down to 1 by 1. And that's pretty much the size of your evaluation area. If we bring it all down to 1 to 1, it could take a very, very long time to render, but the effect will be much better. So there's, you really have to play around with it to get the correct effects. And I'm just going to close that out right now. But radiosity can be a bit touchy, and especially for your rendering times, you want to make sure that you're really paying close attention to what you have your settings as, because it can take a long time to render things with radiosity, and a lot of people don't use it because of that. So if you can play around with your settings and your adaptive sampling, you'll be able to produce some pretty neat effects with some slow render times, although the quality might not be as good. There's another thing I want to show you too, and pretty much mostly the power of radiosity, and that is the ability to even light up an extremely totally dark room with an ambient light source. So we're going to go ahead now and load in a cube. I'm going to make this cube a little bit bigger and drop it down, and I'm actually going to be booleaning this cube so we have a nice cutout in the inside, or we could probably just fly out or fly into the inside. And we'll take a look at our preview here and see what kind of effect we get just by being inside. And we might not see anything at all because it's kind of blocking it out, which is kind of what's happening. So we are going to go ahead and make a boolean, which I'm just going to Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste. So now we've pasted our new cube in there, and I just want to cut out the inside of this room. So I'm going to select first object, and then our second object, and we're going to go to our Boolean difference. And now we've cut out the center of our room. And because of our preview, of course, because we actually have our settings up really high, I'm going to go back and change that under the user settings, and click Edit. I'm going to do Custom, and right now I just want to go to Faster, so you can see a much quicker preview of what's going on. And that looks good. We'll make a little volumetrics a little faster, and click OK. And this will boost up rendering speeds, but right now this room is going to show up as completely black. And if we turn off radiosity by going to our atmosphere editor, and we go to standard, and we just render that, we're going to see that it's completely black. And even if we turn on radiosity, it's completely black. And that's because there is no light getting into this room. There's no light inside of this box, which we're just pretty much going to represent as a room. Now, for more realistic lighting, we can actually add in, what I'm going to add is a sphere into the room. And I'm going to go ahead and scale that down. And we want to bring it down here. And now this is still going to render completely black because there's still no light in there. But we can actually light up this room by making this material with putting a little bit of luminosity onto it. So if we go to Edit Material and we go to Effects, we can adjust how luminous the object is. We can also control this with a function if we wanted to. But I'm going to bump that all the way up to 100%. We could even bring it up even higher if we wanted to 600, so it's extremely bright, and click OK. And now with our radiosity settings on, we're going to notice that our room is actually going to light up. But first, if we take a look at just a standard lighting model, we'll see that that sphere actually shows up because it is luminous. So it's going to show up with no light at all. So if you don't have any light sources, which we don't in this case, it will still show up. But we want to affect the room by using the radiosity, and global illumination won't do that. So we're going to set it to global radiosity, and we can adjust our gain up and down as we want to kind of get a render in there. And I'm just going to wait a sec for our render preview to refresh so we can see how that looks. And we have a little bit of a display problem on the side of the preview, but that's mostly because our position of the camera, we're probably intersecting with one of the walls. But you can see that we're actually lighting up the room and the walls and everything around this object with just this luminous sphere. So that's the beauty of radiosity, is the ability to just directly reflect light. So pretty much everything in life is reflective. It's just not necessarily as obvious as a mirror or as glass or something like that. So we have little bits of reflection here and there, and radiosity is the way to get our sort of our color reflection, and in this case our luminous reflection that we have just from this little sphere that could light up this entire room if we put our gain up high enough. And now the only problem with that is I wouldn't recommend using this method to light an entire room unless you wanted completely realistic results, but it will take a extremely long time to render, and you can notice right now it's very grainy, and if we were to actually render it, it would look very grainy. And if we bumped up our gain to actually light up the whole room as if it was a light, which we could do, which would give us a very realistic looking result, but would probably take a good 48 hours just to render a very small frame of that, and especially if you have reflective objects and things like that in the room. Now, if you really want that radiosity effect, what you can actually do is bake your objects. And what that is rendering one frame for an entire animation. And pretty much what you're doing, in this case, we could actually bake the illumination onto this cube in the inside. And what that will do is create the texture where it's going to render each one of these walls and map it as a texture. And then we can go ahead and turn off radiosity and actually use something to actually light up our material. And we can bake our objects, any object at all, with our lighting features, so that we don't have to worry about rendering that radiosity frame every single time, because it could take forever. So it's a way to really speed up what we're doing. So what it'll do is it'll render one frame, which will take a very long time, but each additional frame will not take as long, because we'll be using our illumination as a baked surface. Now, this doesn't work for animated lights, unfortunately, and just because that would kind of defeat the purpose, but it's for when you have the same lighting situation and you just kind of want to have an animation with that lighting. So it doesn't really work with animated objects. And that with animated lights, you are going to have to change and render everything in or the radiosity, which can take a very long time. But I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and we're going to bake an object. So I'm going to File, New, and I'm going to select just the basic scene we have here. Let's see. And we'll select the clear spring and click OK, and no, we don't want to save it. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and bake the illumination onto an object. Now, unfortunately, you cannot bake standard objects. You can only bake meshes. So if we load in a sphere, and we try to go to its options, we should go to right mouse click and go to edit object, we're unable to. So we have to be baking a mesh. Well, if you have a primitive object, first you're going to have to bake two polygons, and this is just going to turn it into a mesh. We could also set the level. We can make this, we'll make it about 6100 polygons, and click OK. And now we have a mesh object which we can bake. And we're going to right mouse click and go to edit object. You could also just double click on the object, which will bring up this same view. And as you can see, we have an illumination baking option, but all of it's grayed out. And the reason for that is there's nothing in the scene right now that needs to be baked. And that's because our lighting is not set to the way it was because we created a new scene. So if we go to Atmosphere Editor and click on, we're just going to use Global Illumination right now, and click OK. Now we have a nice little effect where we have that nice blue from the sky on there, and that little bit of a extra shadow on the ground. Now we can bake this object. So if we right mouse click and go to Edit Object, now our illumination baking options are available to us. Now this first option we have up here is Allow Automatic Baking for Animations. And what this will do is select this specific object to be automatically baked for an animation. So if you're going to have an animation, it will automatically bake your object, and then you don't have to worry about actually going in and doing that manually. So it will automatically bake your object. Now, View also automatically detects whether or not you need to bake both sides of that object. And keep in mind, baking is only going to bake this sort of blue tint we've added on here, and sort of this grayish tint that we have for this specific object. It will not calculate the shadow into that, just because with certain animation, certain things, lighting effects, you might not want that to take into account. So your shadows will be calculated upon rendering, and it will have to calculate that. Baking will just speed up the process a little bit. One thing we can't do, though, is we can't bake the ground plane. So if you wanted to bake the ground plane, what I would suggest doing is adding in a small two-dimensional plane that you would add on the ground that you could bake. Mostly because large planes do not work well with baking because it is based on an image. And that image we actually have set to map accuracy. If we bring this all the way up to high, which is 100%, it's going to create a much larger map for our UV map that's going to be on our object, specifically our sphere right now. Now, if you have a very complex mesh, what you're going to want to do is actually increase this effect more than 100%. But if you see, as I do that, it increases our estimated size in memory. So if you don't have a lot of memory on your system, you're not going to want to go up extremely high, because it can eat a lot of resources. And we also have our quality boost, which is just going to give us our overall quality of our actual render, which could increase our rendering times. What we also have up here is forced double-sided baking. Now, because it will automatically evaluate whether or not it should bake both sides of this sphere, so whether or not it should bake the inside and the outside, which it should detect that it will only bake the outside, but if you really needed that inside also baked, you could force double-sided. So that way, no matter what View thinks, it will bake the inside as well. But with a lot of meshes, you don't exactly need double-sided on if they're enclosed. So you can turn that off a lot of the time, and that'll also speed up your rendering. And another thing I want to note in here too is you also have the ability to change your smoothing angle on your objects within your, so depending if you want the object to be polygonal looking, you can actually bring down your smoothing angle down to 0%, and it will give you that nice polygon look if you're looking for that. Or you can bring the smoothing up even higher if you feel the object isn't smooth enough. So you can also change that in here. But if we want to bake our object, let's say we can bake it now. So we're going to bake that right now, and now it's preparing our mesh sphere, which is the name of our object. And now it's going to bake our actual mesh. And now that we have it baked, it also gives us our information. Right here, our quality is 12%, so it's rather low. our map accuracy is 48%. In other words, the size of our map is 48%. Of course, that number really doesn't mean too much because you can go a lot higher than 100% and make some larger UV maps. And then it tells how big the size is in our memory. What we can also do is remove that baking if we wanted to, just by clicking this button, which will delete the baking on this object. But I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now our scene is going to render much quicker on that, at least around that sphere, because it is baked. And we don't need to worry about the global illumination on that sphere anymore. And actually, if we take a look at the actual material now, if you go to Edit Material, and we're going to take a look at the function editor for that, we're going to notice that there is no change. There's nothing added to this because of that baking. So you don't have to worry about it messing up anything in the function editor, because it will be automatically added to your object that you're baking, and you don't have to worry about it messing up any of your actual functions that you have for your textures, materials, things like that. So you can bake these objects and not have to worry about it. But like I said, baking is specifically for certain lighting effects. As you can see, we have a little bit of reduced quality now that we're actually rendering this separately. And shadows, of course, are not affected. So if we change our light right now, which I'm going to grab our sun, and I want to zoom out in our top view so we can really see it, and just move it around on a different part. Maybe bring it over on the side over here so we have the shadow on the other side. You can see that our shadow is not there and hasn't been applied. So that is not calculated into baking. It is specifically for the bouncing of light if you have radiosity on, and sort of the other bouncing of light if you have global illumination on. And baking is only made available when you have global illumination on or global radiosity. So you're unable to use these specific features when those functions are not made available and you're not rendering, because pretty much you won't need them. And that's the reason why. So it's not really a restriction, it's the fact that you won't need it and you won't see an increase in quality if you use it. So now we're actually going to load in a preset scene that comes with View, just so that make sure that you have it, and it should be on the CD that you can load in. And we're going to go File, Open, and we're just going to load in that scene if I can find it. And it's right here, this second one. And it says right here, Global Radiosity Render. And this is a scene that was used in the presentation of Vue. And you can actually see that for a lot of the demonstrations that have been showed to show some of the advanced effects that are available in this software program. So we're going to load that in, click OK, and we're not going to save what we have, unless of course you want to save that. And we're going to take a look at this rather complex object. Now this object is entirely imported in. This was not created in Vue. At least I'm pretty sure it wasn't, because it seems a little bit too complex. I don't think you can do a lot of this stuff in Vue as far as the modeling. But you are able to render it in here and use some of the quality and the material editing. Now this is a scene that would not look good if it didn't have radiosity. And the reason for that is, if we take a look at the actual scene, we have one light. We have our sunlight shining directly down through this kind of hole in the top of our little cathedral type thing. Now the problem with that is, if we were using standard lighting, is that all the areas in here would not be receiving light, and they would just show up as black. And you can see our preview render right now is taking a very long time to render. So if we actually take a look at our render options, or actually, we'll take a look at our lighting options under the atmosphere editor, you can see we have global radiosity on. And that's allowing to light up sort of the insides, and it's bouncing our light around. And if we go back to standard and actually render this, you'll see that everything is completely black inside, and there's no bounced light. We do have a little bit of ambient light in here, but not much. So radiosity is very powerful. But in this case, if you're rendering something like this, where it is taking a very long time to render, and we right mouse click and go to Edit Object, which actually this object is broken up into smaller pieces. I'm going to close this out. Just a little bit of a display error there. Go back to Edit Object. And we can see this is set to allow automatic baking for animations. So if we go to render this animation, it's automatically going to bake everything for us. We don't need to worry about baking it now, although we could if we wanted to go in and actually make sure that the settings are correct for our render. But if you want, you can play around with this scene, because it's really quite neat. Maybe add some animation to it, and play around with your radiosity settings, or bring in something you've created yourself, and you'll notice a huge change with the radiosity because it allows you to light up areas that normally wouldn't be lit up, and it's a very realistic rendering effect, but it can take a long time to render. Because I keep repeating myself with that, but I really can't stress it enough. It does take a very long time to render, which you will find out very quickly if you try it out.